All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. We are so excited to talk to you today about our second leadership blind spot, storytelling, which is a topic we care deeply about at Root. Today, our very own CEO, Chief Client Fanatic, and best-selling author, Rich Behrens, will be sharing what some of the best organizations are doing differently to craft and communicate a compelling story, and why it's so important to do so for your people and for your business. My name is Meg. I will be serving as your chat host today. My goal is to make sure you all have a voice in today's discussion. If you know anything about Root, you know we like to keep things fun and interactive, so today will be no different. You will have opportunities throughout the webinar to share your thoughts, so please keep your chat panel open and don't be shy. First, I will ask you to go into your chat panel and make sure you have selected your chat to all participants, and you should be good to go. Just to make sure we've all found our way there, let's kick it off with our first chat question. Where are you all joining us from today? We got Chicago, Portland, California, Greenville, South Carolina, lots of mommies, Arizona, Pittsburgh, Phoenix, all over the place, Connecticut. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us. So Rich, just so you know, here's how we would like to approach this today. While you share with us your insights on how leaders can craft a compelling story, we will be getting our wheels turning on questions we would like to ask you and areas we'd like you to expand on. We'll be putting our questions and comments into the chat as soon as we think of them. Then at about 20 minutes after the hour, we'll transition into a question and response segment where I'll draw from the chat activity and host a little interview segment. How does that sound?
That sounds fantastic, Meg.
Awesome. Over to you.
All right. Thank you. And thanks, everybody, for joining the 30-minute webinar on storytelling. And how it's a blind spot. So let me just take a minute, maybe just ground everybody again. When we talk about blind spot, what do we really mean, right? Because this is sort of like a human behavior, societal thing, and then that kind of bleeds into leadership. And just to kind of ground us in sort of some funny but poignant examples on sort of human blind spots and beliefs we have. Let me just take us back kind of 100 years, right, where it was only about 100 years ago where you could buy cocaine toothache drops for kids, right, and at your local pharmacy. And I'm sure a lot of folks on the phones probably had a bit of a smirk when they saw the slide, and you can just sort of see the dialogue that might be unfolding. Hey, honey, Annabelle is a little under the weather today. Well, just drop her one of the cocaine toothache drops, and I'm sure she'll be up and running in no time, right? And with the benefit of hindsight, we look at that and we ultimately might be thinking that's a little ridiculous, right? And then, but you can only go 50 years ago, right? If you go into cigarettes, we had essentially dentists and doctors falling all over each other, recommending different brands of cigarettes, and at times even touting the health benefits, right? And once again, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we kind of go and believe that's sort of ridiculous. Or even let me take us to 30 years ago, right? 30 to 40 years ago, carbonated soft drinks, right? And we have the youngest customers in the business, or for a better start in life, start cola earlier, right? And I think, once again, we look at that and we kind of go, you've got to be kidding, right? And these were beliefs that at the time weren't out of the ordinary, out of the norm, but that we now look at and kind of go, oh, that's interesting. I can't believe we thought that was the right way to think about this. And we see the same sort of patterns and behaviors in leadership, right? And in the book and in the research we did, looking back over the past 20 years, we found five in particular, five leadership blind spots. And leadership blind spots, the way we define them, is the areas where our existing beliefs and experiences preclude us from having the most enlightened view of how to lead people effectively. So, in short, I think we believe when we look back 10 or 15 years from now, we'll look at some of these blind spots and say we can't believe that was a great way to run our business or to lead as a leader. And the one we want to deep dive on a little bit today is story, right? And it's about leaders having a compelling story that they believe that they're telling that resonates with their people, when in reality it just really doesn't, right? You know, Steven Spielberg had a saying that says, gaming and storytelling has really stood the test of time. And they're the things that really emotionally appeal to people and that are compelling. Now, the amazing thing is how we have some of the most interesting stories in our businesses based on where we compete and how we compete, but we don't have very compelling ways of sharing them with our folks, right? There's a reason most of us don't take PowerPoint decks to our children when we tell bedtime stories, right? Because they lack narrative, they lack emotion, they tend to lack meaning, right? But yet that's exactly what we do and what we use when we try to create meaningful connections with our people in our business stories. And it tends to fail time and time again. And it's really a weak spot, right? And often storytelling is viewed as somewhat of a soft science or something that's not that important. But really, when you look at effectively moving the needle and engaging people, it is absolutely essential. And it's something that most leaders simply aren't that good at, A, because they either underestimate it, or B, because they're just not very good at the practice of it. And I just want to focus on sort of three very targeted things before we get into the Q&A that are hopefully helpful as you think about your story or your storytelling capabilities, right? And the first one is really about the clarity of your story, right? And as we think about clarity of your story, that often starts with the headline of your story. And in most businesses, the headline of your story is your vision, right? And I can't tell you how many organizations we've worked with where the vision seems to be the result of too many MBAs and consultants locked in a room for too long using big business terminology and creating something that is almost entirely devoid of meaning, right? And if that's the headline to your story, you're not off to a great start. And I'll just give you a couple of generic, not generic, of actual examples of Fortune 2000 organizations where we made minor changes to protect the innocent, but just to give you a bit of a flavor of this. And so as we think about headlines of the story, here's one of them, right? We will become the world's most valued company to customers, colleagues, investors, business partners, and the communities where we work and live. And so, and I don't know if people want to kind of, in the chat, guess. I'd say maybe even just guess, what industry do you think this represents, right? Some might even be willing to venture a guess at the name. I will not ultimately share the names to protect the innocent. But think about who that might be. I'll throw in a second one. Our vision is to be the world's premier industry, this was the actual industry statement, company. Simply put, we want to be the best employer, supplier, business partner, investment, and the best neighbor. If you're wondering if you can't quite take a guess that's particularly meaningful, you're not alone, right? Because the reality is that these things are largely useless, right? They don't really say much of anything, and they don't really do much of anything. And once again, these are not random ones that we created. These are actual ones from very, very large organizations from around the country. But there's lots of this out there. And so as you think about the headline of your story, and as you think about the clarity of your story, there's a couple of components to think in mind. And if you have a vision statement or a headline of your story, maybe in your head you can sort of do a real-time assessment of how good it is as I give you three components of things that really make a story and the headline of a story more effective. And so the first thing you have to think about is, to what degree does it describe effectively what winning looks like, right? An articulation of kind of a future promise and a future state that's compelling and exciting. To what degree does it define what uniquely sets you apart from the competition? So what is unique about what you do and the difference that you make? And then lastly, does it create excitement in people to pursue the path? And so does it create an emotional connection so that people want to be a part of it? And so the good headline of a story does all three of those components. I think if you look at the previous statements, you will find none of that represented, which is why it's not particularly meaningful. We'll give you a couple of examples of organizations that we're not necessarily endorsing, but they do a decent job of that, and maybe we can even venture a guess and these who that is. And so let me give you one in terms of a headline. Our vision is to create a better everyday life for the many people Our business idea supports this vision by offering a wide range of well-designed, functional home furnishing products at prices so low that as many people as possible will be able to afford them. I don't know if we have any guesses there, Meg, online, if we get any. Okay, there's a guess for IKEA. That's correct, Tony. Right? So,
nice job, Tony.
So our first guess was accurate. Well done, but I think there's a reason, right? And so A was much more descriptive, and it was much more clear, and it spoke to the three aspects that we talked about. Let's do one more. This company, now this is a bit of a giveaway in its explanation, but designs, manufactures, and launches advanced rockets and spacecraft. The company was founded in 2002 to revolutionize space technology, what it wants to do uniquely, with the ultimate goal of enabling people to live on other planets. Before I even ask the question, I see things, okay, Boeing, SpaceX, it is NASA, SpaceX, it is SpaceX. So that's Elon Musk, and I know he's got his own challenges and issues, but he's an unbelievable entrepreneur, and that is the ambition, right, and that he has great passion around. So these are great headlines to stories. There's more to a story than just a headline, but it's a headline that encompasses what winning looks like, what makes us unique, and they have an emotional component. And so as you think about the headline to your story, whether it's your team, whether it's your company, whether it's your organization, whether it's your sports team, whatever that is, how well are you incorporating that as a headline to what you do, right? And so as you think about the clarity of your story, think about an effective headline to your story that reaches those components. And it's one that leaders often underestimate and, quite frankly, don't get right. The second component I want to focus on is the concept of shared meaning. And so I'm going to throw out a word here, Meg, and I'll see what imagery comes to mind. So if you're on the phone, I want you to kind of close your eyes for a second and kind of type in the imagery of what comes to mind. So when I say the word bear, what's the image that's in your head that comes to mind? And we'll see if we get some responses here, as I'm curious to see.
A strong bear.
Okay, we get strong. There's an image of strength that comes into somebody's mind.
Polar bear.
Okay.
Black bear walking in the woods.
Woods, okay.
California, shaggy, snuffing. Grizzly. Trees with no leaves.
Trees with no leaves.
Continental.
Bunny. Panda. Forest. Black. Scary. So we're getting all kinds of different imagery. And I think if we keep talking, sometimes what also hear with clients, in addition to all the different bears and the different emotions, we might also hear bear aspirin, right?
Yep,
or somebody just typed in aspirin, right? Or somebody might even say bear market. The point being is a word evokes lots of different imagery and emotion in our heads, right? And the same will happen often as you think about strategy decks, right? And when we use the word, I'll just say a word that probably customer focus, right? Innovation, just as we might say, go execute on this bear thing, which is the scary, funny, grizzly, brown bear, aspirin sort of thing that has all kinds of different interpretations. The same likely happens as we talk about what we mean by innovation, what we mean by customer experience, what we mean by transformation. And so we often have as many different images and meanings of those images in our heads as their words in a PowerPoint deck. And as we have different meaning and different images, we execute in a different way. And so what we see happens constantly, we get nodding heads by people when they go through a PowerPoint deck and say, oh yeah, we're aligned, we agree on this, we agree this is important. And then we ask people to draw this out, to really explain further what it means to them and how they activate it, and we get as many interpretations as we have people in the room. And that leads to really inconsistent execution and, quite frankly, a story that we lack shared meaning around, right? And that creates real issues, and it's a real opportunity area for leaders. I'll give you a very practical example where we were with a global chemical company, and we were with the president of a division, and they had a strategy, and they gave us the story and the strategy, and, you know, we visualize things. It's one of the things that we do, and so we came back a few days later having visualized their storyline to get feedback on how closely we got that right. And the head of strategy said, oh, you guys nailed it. This is fantastic, right? And the president of the division said, I don't know what you're talking about. I think this is terrible. This is way off, right? He's like, and then the strategy guy said, no, that's not way off. That's exactly it, right? That's exactly what we said. And he said, well, if that's what we said, that's not what I meant, right? And then it got quiet and everybody stopped. It's like, whoa, wait a second, right? That's not what we meant. That means we're having a chasm and a disconnect in how we're thinking about this content. And I can't tell you how often that happens, where we actually don't have true clarity on our story and a sense of alignment around it. And so the second piece that becomes really important in story is the sense of shared meaning, and really double-click. Do we have clarity on the story, one, and then second, do we have shared meaning around the story, right? Because if you don't, you're going to have a hard time with the execution of it. And then one last piece on story, real quick before we go into the Q&A, and that is your authentic ability to share the story, right, and making it personal and creating emotional connections. And that's not necessarily easy, right? So the story was written up in Time magazine a couple of years ago. It's pretty powerful, but it talks about the March on Washington, 1963, and it was really, they're looking to galvanize the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King was a two-day event, and he was kind of bring this to a close and once again really galvanize the crowd of, I think, they say tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. I think it was about a couple hundred thousand, and he was working with his team on the speech that was going to do this, and they were working at the Willard Hotel, I think, for several days in advance, and he had this multi-page speech, 6-7 pages, essentially single-spaced, and he started to deliver that as he started his speech on the second day, and he was not capturing the crowd. He was not necessarily resonating with them. It's been a long day and a half, and it was essentially a policy speech, right? But then one of his friends, the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, said, "Martin, forget it. Tell him about the dream. Tell him about the dream, Martin," right? And he started telling Elvis about his dream, right? And he spoke in a way that emotionally connected with so many, and what's considered to be one of the greatest speeches probably in the last 100 years, right? And one that really did galvanize the civil rights movement and gave birth and energy to something that was profound and powerful. Now there's few of us who have the oratory capabilities of a Martin Luther King, but that's not the point, right? The point is, how does your content of your story best connect with those you're trying to reach, right? How are you authentic to yourself, and how are you conscious and aware of who you're trying to reach and how you reach them, right? Because in many ways, our employees or your team, they're the customer of your story. They're the customer of your strategy. And so this is something that you need to be thinking about. How do you sell this? How do you engage them as customers of your story to have them be a part of it and to have them feel connected to it? So in short, think about, there's lots of different components of the story, and there's more detail in the book, and we can talk about it in other aspects. But for kind of the quick hit, think about the clarity of your story and an effective headline. Think about the shared meaning that you've generated with it. And then lastly, your authentic ability to tell it in a way that meaningfully connects with people and with your desired audience. And so you do those three things, and I think your ability to be sharper, better, and more effective with the story will be a lot better than a lot of the leadership teams and leaders that we've seen over the last 20 years, because it's something that is a blind spot and something that we're often, collectively, all of us, myself included, not as good as we should be. So that's kind of my quick 15-minute piece there, Meg, and I know we wanted to make sure we have about 10 minutes for Q&A and any sort of dialogue, which I think we have.
Yeah, so feel free to start letting your questions flow. I can get us started. I know I have a question for you to kick us off. So I know a lot of our participants know that this is a series for us of webinars for leadership blind spots. We heard from Jim a few weeks ago on purpose. I was curious why you decided to start with story and what it really means to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think why, I'll sort of give you two answers to it. One is, as you think about the flow of how we talk about blind spots, it is the second. I will be super pragmatic, and I think in many ways, if you think about purpose and what Jim talked about, are you clear on your why, right? And that is really important. But once you're clear on your why, you have to make sure that the narrative and the story really supports that in an effective way, right? And that's really powerful. And then stories, just from a personal standpoint, it's a couple of things. I think one is, if I reflect on my time, and I think back on my career too, is I don't think I used to be a great storyteller when I first started. I didn't give it credence and credit in terms of the importance, right? And so, I'm naturally a pretty analytical person. I like numbers, I like facts, and so I used to lead with a lot of facts and saying if I am the smartest and have the best data and have the best facts, surely it'll make sense to everybody else, and they will agree with me and agree with my point, and they will support. And I sort of learned the hard way that that doesn't really engage emotionally with people and doesn't reach their heart, right? And so it was over time through my own experiences, and then quite frankly what I saw with really great leaders and not so good leaders, the difference. And so it's something that we found to be a material difference maker in a lot of the work that we've done with clients.
Awesome. I did get one question so far. So is shared meaning taking the time to define keywords, or is it more of the story than that? So is there more to it, or is it just finding the right words?
Yeah, no, that's a great question actually, and it is definitely more than that, right? And that's one of the last pieces you do to then make sure you have effective shared meaning. But I can't tell you how often we've been with leadership teams where we would get the consultant deck or the internal strategy deck, and we asked if there's alignment on what's in there, and we would get the nodding of the heads, and then they would we would ask them to tell the story and prioritize kind of what's really in the deck, and we go all over the place. And what it really often indicates is that you're not as clear as you think you are on the content that you're pursuing, and you're not as aligned as you think you are. And so what shared meaning is in many ways a gateway to make sure you have a greater sense of alignment and conviction, right? I mean, one thing I'll often do with teams, I'll say, hey, as we're thinking about this issue, we talked about innovation, we talked about customer experience, take the issue that you believe is a bear in your organization, right? And one thing you could do is, as you have your team around the table, give everybody a half-size Post-it note and tell them and ask them to draw the essence of the issue in a quick napkin sketch, right? And then you pair them into teams of two and have them compare what they drew and create a synthesized drawing. And then depending on the number of people, you might do this one more time and then have them share. And I think what you'll find is you'll get very clear on where are we actually viewing things the same way and where are we not. And we probably have to have further conversations on strategy or maybe even on decisions we need to make, right? And so it becomes a clarifier, and it becomes essentially a strategic alignment process. And then once you have that, you've got to make sure you use the right words and you explain things the right way. But no, that's a great question. And very often, the lack of shared meaning gives you an indication of other issues and opportunity areas you should focus on.
Mm-hmm. That leads us pretty nicely to the next question I want to ask. So a lot of that may have to do with emotion, right? So what is your opinion on the common thought, we buy on emotion and justify with logic?
I think there's a lot of truth in that, right? And there's even data that supports that, and a lot of factual research that, I mean, it's not universally true in all instances, and it depends a little bit on what you buy, right? There's some areas that have a greater propensity for emotion to be the primary driver, but there's a lot of truth in that, and factual and the research basis to support it. And it translates to strategy, right? So if we think of consumers, right, and there's watches we buy that are 50 times more expensive than other watches that work, right? And it's for reasons of emotion, right? Whether may that be driven by status, may that be driven by history, may that be driven by legacy, whatever that may be. And you can make the argument for lots of different products and services. But the point is, if that's how we act as consumers, that's likely how we think, perceive, and act as employees who are consumers of strategy, right? And so as you think about that, how do you connect emotionally, right? How do you tell stories that resonate with people? How do you find examples that speak to the heart, not just to the mind, right? That speak to the emotion, not just to the intellect. And then this is where, once again, go through your next deck that you might be using to present and say, how many of my slides and how many of my points in here speak to the emotional part and how many speak to the intellectual part? And I think what we tend to find is that 95% of what we present speaks to the intellectual side, 5% or less speaks to the emotional side. And we're not saying to switch that 100%, but be more balanced, because if you really want to move the needle, you got to speak to the emotion.
Perfect. So what are some effective ways to build storytelling muscle with our organizational leaders?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways. I mean, I think one is, to be honest, is practice, right? It is amazing to me. And there's sort of, I'm not going to get into the basics now, what makes a good story versus a bad story. Well, we just talked about a story headline, but there's a lot more to story. So one is actually just understanding what makes an effective story, right, and what creates an effective flow. And so there's some good mechanics there. But even if you have the good mechanics and you got the story right and you speak to the intellect and to the emotional component of it, it is still amazing how often people are just simply not very good storytellers, right? And storytellers, that's about timing. That's about pauses. That's about emphasis. And some of that you can get a lot better with practice, right? And it still amazes to me how often folks might be addressing 100, 200, 500 employees, or it could just be your team, and they haven't really practiced their narrative, right? They haven't really practiced their story or their speech or how they articulate it, and it shows, right? And often people have time. We've probably all been in the conversation with somebody who's, I have too much information on the slide for the time. Apologies. I'll just skip through this. And there's so much stuff on it that no human being could possibly understand, right? And it's so not focused on your end user, right? And so just be conscious, be clear on your story itself, and practice it. I hate to say it this way, but it's I still do it. I tell lots of stories. I do a lot of this, and I find myself in the front of the mirror all the time when I have to address an audience to make sure I get the details right. And that doesn't mean I get it right, but hopefully I get a little bit better every time.
Mm-hmm. And that leads into a next question, which I will say we have about 2 minutes left in our normal time of 30 minutes. We will go over, because I do think there's value in sharing the rest of these questions. So if you do need to leave at 11:30, we understand. You will be getting a recording, so you can catch up from there. But if you want to stay on, feel free to do that as well. So leading into this next question, as we talked about how you can be a better storyteller, how do you think a company's external story can be best promoted to internal employees to boost engagement and the feeling of shared meaning?
Yeah, good question. I think what's interesting here is how actually interesting most of the companies we've worked with, how interesting their stories are, and how uninteresting we make them, right? And you look at most industries today, right? And if you look at this, the change in technology and the implications, right, and kind of the quote-unquote battles that are going on for who's winning, how the customer expectations are changing, the competitive environment, and the emerging competition that's coming in, and the dynamics that are playing out and the drama really that's happening in most industries is fascinating. And it's really interesting, actually, if you can articulate it in the right way. But we have an ability to make that so boring when we translate it to our folks, right? It's like we have more drama in some of our industries than in some of the best television shows, right? We just don't convey it. And so one is we don't convey it. We don't give meaning to it. We don't give context to it. We don't give narrative and emotion to it, right? And then the second one now, how do you emphasize points of the emotion? It's the true impact it might have on the customer, on the employee, on the world, right? There's points of emphasis that, for the most part, we've had lots of clients who will make their story about a number. We want to be twice as big. Most of your people, unless they have a ton of stock options, don't care that much. They really don't, right? But they'll care about the difference we might try to make in the world and society with clients, the kind of company we're trying to build, the kind of culture that we have. And so speak to those elements as you think about your story and your narrative. And there's a good chance, I bet, in most of the folks that are on this phone, and most times, you're sitting on the raw material of great stories. We just often find a way to not make them great. Does that make sense?
That does, yes. And I have one last question I want to share. So kind of 2 in 1. So how often are companies trying to paint the picture of who they want to be versus who they actually are? So what are those things that they do where they may miss on really showing their authentic self?
It happens a good amount, right? And that to what degree are they comfortable with a certain amount of vulnerability and honesty? And as we work with change a lot and clients who change a lot, we we always talk about you have to, before you define a compelling future state, you have to define reality and where your starting point is, because that gives you buy-in, that gives you credibility, and that gives you that sort of authentic, hey, we know we're not perfect, and we know they're honest in terms of where we are and where we're trying to go. So I actually think it's a really important component. I think it buys you a lot of credibility. I think the honesty and the vulnerability of even, here's where we are not perfect, here's where we don't know the answers, here's where this is going to be difficult, and here's our starting point, and sometimes it's in a good place and sometimes not so good place, is a really important part of the story, right? And is essential that I can kind of create the buy-in for them to want to get to the future, right? To kind of where we are today is actually just as important as where we're looking to go, to have the right kind of credibility. So I think it's essential. I think it's a great point. And very often, absent that, you know, we've seen so many employees who would like the flavor of the day. This too shall pass. This is just the next storyline of the next group of leaders, right? And if you're not honest about, once again, where you're coming from and some of the things that are not so pretty, which we all have, right? None of our stories are perfect, I would venture to guess. But there is authenticity, honesty, and power in that if we embrace it.
Awesome. Well, I think this has been a really great discussion on storytelling. Any final words?
No, I think thank you for listening. I think maybe the final words would be is hopefully this was helpful in providing any sort of advice or insight in terms of how do I make my story more effective, right? Or how do I help my organization be more effective in the story that they're looking to tell? And I think if we just raise the level of awareness of this being one element of better engagement and better leadership, I think we'll all be better off.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again for joining us today. We hope to see you at the next one.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining.